This is a shock in the dark. I got a story that breaks all the rules here, and it's 100% true. I got witnesses. First 3 rules I'm gonna break. Number 1, I am not gonna give you the layout of my house. Number 2, you will never hear me say, that will be important later. And 3, I'm not changing anybody's name to protect the innocent. Okay, so here goes. So it's me and my 2 friends, Sandwich and DOODAH. Okay, so those aren't their names on their birth certificates, but that's what everybody calls them. So it's the 3 of us. We're all 17, and we had decided to go camping one weekend on some land my dad owned about an hour outside of Dayton, where we all lived. We were having such a great time just being out on our own. We were in a place where nobody knew us, and we felt like we were the impressive, cool city kids driving out in the middle of the sticks. We were in DOODAH's old beat-up convertible Mustang. Not the cool kind, but when they made those terrible Mustangs in the 80s or whatever. We had the music turned up, we were eating Cheetos and drinking Monsters, and we were really feeling our freedom. Until we got pulled over. Suddenly, all of us turned into well-behaved, respectable, nice boys. It was all, yes sir, and no sir. 2 hands on the wheel, trying our damnedest to telepathically project the look of young innocence out of our faces. Anyway, DOODAH got a ticket. We got back on the road and had driven another 10 miles before we were able to lose the tension in our bodies. I mean, we weren't doing anything wrong. None of us really ever drank or did any drugs, but when you're 17 and you get pulled over, there's this natural instinct to want to pee your pants. Suddenly, Sandwich says, "Oh my God." We looked at him as if to say, "Yeah?" Sandwich pointed to the little box stuck to DOODAH's windshield. "Is this thing working?" We all laughed real hard when we realized that Sandwich was talking about the dash cam stuck behind the rearview mirror. We would be able to watch ourselves get pulled over by the cops, and if we looked cool in the video, maybe we could post it on YouTube and get some cred. Well, several turns later, and another 20 minutes of the roads getting smaller and smaller and bumpier, we were almost to the spot where we would be camping. But as we rounded a sharp curve, DOODAH slammed on the brakes. We were stunned. There, sitting in the middle of the road, silhouetted by the setting sun, was a giant, hairy beast. Even though the sun made it hard to see his face, we could tell he was looking at us. So we sat there for what seemed like forever, but I'm sure it was only a few seconds, just staring at each other. When suddenly, this thing stood up, and I cannot begin to describe to you how huge and muscly this thing was. We started screaming at DOODAH to hurry up and back out of there, but he was in shock or something, because he was just sitting there frozen, staring at this thing, both hands still on the wheel. And as this thing approached the front of the car, closer to the passenger side, and as Sandwich and I did our best to lean as far away from this thing as possible, the most shocking part of this story became evident to all of us. This giant, hairy, humanoid creature we encountered in the woods was not Bigfoot. This was a full-grown adult male silverback gorilla. I know that sounds crazy, but there's just no disputing it. We're not animal experts or anything, but anybody who's ever seen a nature documentary or been to a zoo would be able to immediately identify this as a gorilla. For sure, 100%. This gorilla was all of 3 or 4 feet away from us, and it just stopped for a minute and looked at each of us like, what are you doing here? But in a half-interested kind of way. Then it just walked into the forest on the side of the road. And that was it. I swear DOODAH was still frozen to the wheel. But all of us were in shock, really. We talked about it, and the 3 of us quickly agreed that we no longer wanted to camp in that area. We checked the dash cam, and it recorded nothing of our whole trip. No gorilla, no getting pulled over. It probably hadn't worked in years. So we decided not to report it. I mean, who were we going to report it to anyway? I did end up telling my dad, but I think he thinks I was pulling his leg. And the crazy part is, anytime any of us tries to tell one of our friends about this, they refuse to believe us. They always say the same thing in a really dismissive way. They say, "Come on, you didn't see a gorilla. It was probably just a Bigfoot or something." My grandfather was about the most respectable, upstanding person you could ever imagine. For example, when the U.S. got involved with World War II, he tried to join the fight so that he could spare some other young man's life. He was volunteering his life for the life of a complete stranger. But he never even made it past the first part, never even made it to the physical. He was turned away for lying about his age. He was trying to convince them that he was 18, but he was actually 13. And any time he told that story, he always hung his head in shame because he felt so guilty about lying. Because lying was a sin. You know, he also had regret that he was not, in the Pacific or Europe somewhere, when every day came the news of another hometown boy who had lost his life. But the part that seemed to really bother him was the fact that he had told a lie. In my grandfather's eyes, lying was the most disrespectful and shameful thing a man could do. Often enough, my grandfather had absolutely nothing else but his word. If his word was worthless, then so was he. I think it's the thing that made him so against lying. My grandfather was a good Christian man, Southern Baptist. In fact, he was a deacon in the church, which I can't tell you what a deacon is, but apparently it's a position of honor. He did hard work, back-breaking work every single day of his life, except for Sundays, of course. from the time he turned 14 to the day he finally died, 21 years ago this December. He took good care of Grandma. They didn't have much in the way of money, but Grandpa always made sure his family had a warm place to sleep, clothes in their back, food in their belly. And once that was done, he would help his neighbors. He was, by all accounts, a good man. But there was something unusual about Grandpa. Nothing important, nothing big, nothing that had any bearing on his character or his worth. Just a small, yet very unusual novelty. A peculiar physical deviation of no great consequence, but of enormous interest as an oddity to his 5 grandkids. Grandpa was born with no big toes. That's right. He had 4 toes on each foot. Total of 8 toes. But where the largest toe was supposed to be, there was nothing. It never seemed to affect his balance or, the way he walked or anything. He did sometimes have a piece of cork in each shoe when he wore his dress shoes because he said it made the shoe fit better, but other than that, his missing toes were only a source of entertainment for us grandkids. We'd all be hanging out at my grandmother and grandfather's house when one of us would say, "Take off your shoe, Grandpa." And Grandpa would take off his shoe and his sock, and we would sit there and stare at his foot. I have no idea why we found it so fascinating. To us, it was a bottomless pit of wonder. My father said that when he was a little kid in the 50s, it was the same way. He and his siblings could never get enough of looking at Grandpa's 4 toes per foot. Our grandmother died back in the summer of 2000, and shortly after that, in the winter, our grandfather died. My brother and I were selected to go to their house and get everything in order, remove and distribute to family members anything of sentimental value, and sell the house and any belongings that weren't important to us in some way. And it was while doing that my brother found a tiny jar containing 2 shriveled up adult big toes. At first he thought it was little pieces of some kind of fruit that had gone bad, but it looked more like meat, like beef jerky, suspended in a dirty, clear liquid. But one look in direct sunlight made it all too clear. The toenails are a dead giveaway. Even if we make a giant leap and assume that these are my grandfather's toes, there's still about 1 billion questions. This man, who would rather do anything than lie, and says that lying to someone is the, ultimate disrespect, lies to his family, his children, and his grandchildren for decades? Who removed his toes? Did he do it himself? Why? Why on earth would you chop off your toes or have somebody else chop off your toes? Did my grandmother know about this? Why did he still have the toes? What was he going to do with them? Why did he not have scars where his toes used to be? For what it's worth, my brother believes the scars are closer to the bottom of his foot, so they aren't as noticeable, especially when his foot would be flat on the floor. But is there any reason that anybody can think of, like an old medical practice that's no longer in use, a superstition, any religion that would use removal of toes as a ritualistic device, or secret club, or a mental disorder that drives one to remove their own body parts, or maybe an antiquated punishment? Like those people who have their hand removed for stealing? Really, I would accept any reason at all. What I cannot accept is no reason. I keep thinking that what I've been going through, losing my vision, must be worse than being born blind. Because you know what you're missing. And the darkness, it just creeps in like a full 360-degree sunset. Because of my condition, I've had to dictate this email to my phone, and I can't really proofread it, so I apologize in advance for any errors. I've always had poor sight. I've worn glasses for as long as I can remember and had the nickname Four Eyes to prove it, although nobody really calls me that anymore. I suppose it would be too cruel. That's why it took so long to catch the symptoms. Essentially, I was on the verge of death when I got my diagnosis. Diabetes. In my ignorance, I thought I had mono. Luckily, diabetes is manageable to deal with once you've got control over it. The diabetic retinopathy, on the other hand, was past the point of no return. I was going to lose 80% of my sight over the next few months, the doctors said. And soon, I would be living in complete darkness. I never even made the time to see the Grand Canyon. Losing my sight started slowly, barely noticeable. I saw things the way you might after a couple of cocktails. Everything was just a little bit fuzzy. After a while, I noticed my peripheral vision had started closing in. It was like that for quite some time. Noticeable, yet doable, and I thought, well, it might just stop there. And it could be something I could live with. Then, the darkness started to take shape. The doctors referred me to a therapist. They said she would be able to help me through, quote, this difficult transition. She is a good woman, and she's good at her job, I'm sure, but she definitely thinks I'm crazy now that I've told her about the shapes that I see. What does she call them? The product of trauma. The shapes. She says that as I lose my vision, my mind will project things on the emptiness. I know that's not what they are, though. I know this because I don't just see the shapes anymore. Now I can hear them. As crazy as it may sound, the shapes, those horrible little things, now that I can hear them, they're even worse. I'm not rich or extra smart, and this would usually be the last place on earth you would ever see me, but this all really started at the opera. The opera. My idea of what hell must be like, and an amazing way to waste $200. My girlfriend, Lily, she'd been begging me since we started dating to take her to an opera, and I figured I owed her that much. She's such a beautiful woman, and she'd stuck by me step by step as my health declined. It felt like the least I could do. The evening started out amazing. We had a wonderful dinner at our favorite Italian restaurant. We've only been there a few times because it's so expensive, but I was pulling out all the stops and getting way out of my comfort zone as a thank you to her. And she knew it. And she appreciated it. We ate and we drank lots of wine, and by the time we were seated in the theater, I was actually having a great night. The anxiety that plagued me 24/7 since my diagnosis, it didn't even enter my mind. Hell, I was even thinking maybe I would actually enjoy the opera. Then the lights went out. In the blackout, the performers took the stage, but as I sat back and waited in the darkness, I saw one of the shapes. This shape was a face. It was ephemeral, its form constantly shifting, but it was unmistakably a face, and its expression was an expression of pain. And fear in its eyes was just evident. It was stark and overwhelming. I gasped and jumped to my feet, my heart thumping 1,000,000 miles an hour. It felt like my heart was about to bust out of my chest. But just then, the house lights came up. The face disappeared. I looked around and focused as best as I could on all the confused people around me in the theater and the mean looks people were giving me, and I heard a woman loud whisper, "Sit down." I sat down. Somehow, I was already drenched in sweat, but as the first act went on, I was finally able to catch my breath. I left at intermission, and of course, Lily was so angry with me. I wasn't sure how to explain it to her. We argued that night, and in retrospect, I was probably putting the nail in the coffin. A few weeks later, we broke up. I guess I'm happy to spare her the pain of my ordeal, but it definitely hurts me every time she crosses my mind. My strategy with the shapes after that, ignore them. But all the shapes were turning into these ugly faces. These ugly faces making ugly sounds. In my mind, these shapes had stolen my relationship. But I was not going to let them steal my sanity. But every time, in the dark, in the low light, when the sun was setting, these ever-changing masks of horror and distress and anxiety and pain would appear to me. I would ignore them or usually be able to shake them off, but I made the critical mistake of telling my therapist about them. At the end of the session, she wrote me a prescription for sleeping pills. She made a point to warn me not to rely on medication to ease the emotional pain I was experiencing, which seemed kind of hypocritical to me, but I filled the order all the same. That night, I took twice the recommended dose of sleeping pills and washed them down with a Jack and Coke. I know it's abuse of the medication and it's dangerous, but a solid good night's sleep was the only thing in the world I wanted anymore. That sleep, however, would not come. Instead, that was the first night that the shape's noises turned into words. The shapes were speaking to me, and they said the most horrible and hurtful things. They whispered in my ears, but from inside my head, they floated in and out of my waning vision in the dark. They told me things about myself no one else could have ever known. They taunted me with my deepest desires and my sickest secrets. And that wasn't even the worst of it. They liked to tell me how they died, all in horrible, violent ways. Throats slit, necks wrung, bodies slowly succumbing to horrific illness. Their expressions, a mask of the last face they made while they filled my mind with intrusive thoughts of gore and horror. It became debilitating. I started trying to sleep with the lights on, but by this point my vision had all but faded away and the darkness followed me everywhere. It feels so good to be untraceable and to say all this anonymously. There's no one I could say this to. I certainly didn't make the mistake of telling my therapist this time. She'd have me locked away, I'm sure, where I'd be all alone with nothing but the shapes and their horrible faces and nasty, horrible things they say. When I visited the therapist, instead, I sat through my sessions, nodding when I needed to and replying with the words I knew she wanted to hear. All the while, I gripped the arms of the chair with white knuckles and did everything in my power not to stand up and just scream, "Shut up! Shut up!" My sight is gone now. I've become legally blind. But I see more now than I ever have. The faces have grown bodies. Broken, disfigured, rotted with death. I can't see the people I love. I can't see the room I'm in. I'll never see the Grand Canyon. But the shapes, they're clearer than clear. I can see them creep in and out of every room. I see them crawl across the ceiling of my bedroom as I try to sleep at night. I see them with more clarity than I've ever seen another human being, and I hear their voices echo through my head. Every day is a waking nightmare now. The shapes have taken over my life. I've searched everywhere for some remedy to restore my sight. Surgeries exist, but I can't afford those. Knowing that I will never see anything except for these infernal shapes, I've decided that I can no longer fight them. Instead, I've decided to give in. Just succumb. And I know that soon I will join the shapes in that realm of darkness between hell and earth. My face forever frozen with that horrible expression of my last moments. Then I too will lurk in the shadows, whispering the story of my death to whichever poor unfortunate soul loses their sight and their mind. Soon I will be nothing more than a shape, and the haunted will become the haunter as I slip away into darkness for the very last time.